Hello again. I dare say that most viewers will have heard, until they are sick and tired of the subject, about the way in which white Europeans took black people from Africa across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas and Caribbean, selling them there as slaves. What few people in Britain seem to know, though, is that before this happened, the boot was altogether on the other foot, and ships sailing from Africa were raiding England and Ireland to capture people who were then sold as slaves in Africa. For perhaps 1,000 years, Christian Europe was locked in combat with the Muslim world of North Africa and the Middle East. At times, the Muslims appeared to have the upper hand, sweeping up into Spain and setting up a caliphate there, even crossing the Pyrenees into France. At other times, the Christians invaded and conquered the Middle East, establishing a kingdom in Jerusalem. Centuries later, Muslim armies advanced to the very gates of Vienna. Part of this struggle was the so-called marine jihad, waged between the ships of Venice and Spain on the one hand against those of the Ottoman Empire and its North African provinces. Some of the ships sailing from places like Tunis, Tripoli and Algiers made money from this intermittent warfare by capturing slaves from Europe and taking them back to North Africa to sell. The Mediterranean became a little too dangerous for these pirates or corsairs to operate in because of the constant sea battles, and so some slipped past the Straits of Gibraltar and began operating in the English Channel and Irish Sea. There were easy pickings there for slave traders. Fortunately for the corsairs sailing from the Barbary coast, which was what North Africa was known at that time, Barbary being a corruption of Berber, England was not in the early years of the 17th century, time when all this was happening, a formidable sea power. King James VI of Scotland, who had in 1601 ascended to the throne of England as James I of that country, had no particular interest in the navy. The fleet, which had less than 15 years earlier defeated the Spanish Armada, became neglected and, to use the modern jargon, no longer fit for purpose. The ill effects of this could hardly escape the notice of a sea-going people like the English. Although the corsairs from the Barbary coast were quite willing and able to land and take prisoners from villages and towns, many of the slaves whom they seized were sailors from fishing boats and merchant ships. England had always depended upon the sea to supplement its agricultural produce, and many coastal towns had fleets which sailed the English Channel, North Sea and even the Atlantic. These boats were easy prey for the slavers who began to infest the coastal waters which surrounded the British Isles. The extent of the problem may be seen when we learn that between 1609 and 1616, no fewer than 466 English ships were boarded and their crews taken off to be sold in the slave markets of Tunis and Algiers. By 1625, the year in which James I died and was succeeded as King of England by his son Charles, matters had reached a very low ebb indeed. In April 1625, 4 ships sailing from English ports were taken by corsairs, 3 from Cornwall, 1 from Devon. From then on, the situation deteriorated sharply, until by August that year the slavers were not limiting their attacks to shipping, but were actually landing in England to make slaves of those living in coastal villages. A raiding party landed, for instance, at Mounts Bay in Cornwall. When the local inhabitants saw the ships anchored in the bay, they fled to the local church in hope that it would provide sanctuary. The African slave traders, though, had no respect for any Christian place of worship and broke into the church, dragging out more than 60 people and loading them onto the waiting ships. All those taken in this raid ended up in the slave markets of North Africa. On the 12th of August, the Mayor of Plymouth appealed for help to the Privy Council in London. He wrote that in just 10 days, 27 ships had been boarded and the crews taken off into slavery, over 200 men in total. His cry for help read as follows: "The Mayor of Plymouth writes that there are general fears for the ships from Virginia and Newfoundland. 27 ships and 200 persons have been taken by Turkish pirates in 10 days. The mention of Turkish pirates requires some explanation, for the men conducting these operations were not Turkish at all. Because the various nations of North Africa were technically provinces of the Ottoman Empire, any ships associated with the Ottomans in any way were customarily referred to as being Turkish. Turk was in fact used as a synonym at that time for Muslim, and those converting to Islam were said to have turned Turk. The Mayor of Plymouth was not the only person in the West Country of England who was writing to London at that time to alert them to what was going on. That same month, August 1625, the Mayor of Poole is recorded as follows in the correspondence of the time. Mayor of Poole to the Privy Council. Unless measures are taken, the Newfoundland fleet of 250 sail, having on board 4,000 or 5,000 men of the western parts, will be surprised by the Turkish pirates. That both mayors mention Newfoundland is significant. It was not merely a question of a few fisher folk being inconvenienced, or even kidnapped. There were so many slavers now in and around English territorial waters that communication with the American colonies was in danger of being disrupted. Charles I was no more interested in strengthening the navy than his father had been. So ineffectual was this navy by the late 1620s that a truly incredible state of affairs arose. We are most of us aware that the European slave traders who went to West Africa to acquire slaves to take to the Caribbean and the American colonies had bases in Africa from which they operated. Some of these were little more than stockades where they kept the slaves whom they had purchased penned up like animals until a ship arrived which would carry them across the Atlantic Ocean. It may seem beyond belief, but the African slavers who were harrying the British waters at this time also established such a base in a strategic waterway within sight of the English mainland. For most of us, the phrase pirate island conjures up images of a tropical sea and golden beach fringed with palm trees. The island of Lundy, which is in the Bristol Channel and lies about 12 miles off the coast of Devon, was a pirate island of a very different kind. In 1627, a fleet of corsairs from Morocco took control of Lundy and remained there on and off for years. This was a convenient base from which to launch expeditions against other parts of the British Isles beside Cornwall and Devon. Not only the British Isles either. In the summer of 1627, ships sailing from Lundy to Iceland arrived there on 20th of June. A couple of dozen people from a village on the coast were taken prisoner and transported back to Lundy and then on to Algiers. 2 weeks later, a larger group of ships from Algiers also arrived off the coast of Iceland and took away 350 men, women and children. By all accounts, they behaved with great cruelty. I will discuss some of the other incidents, for example, the sacking of the village of Baltimore in Ireland, on another occasion. It's curious to me, and it might be in interest to some viewers, particularly those in Britain, that this complete erasure of part of British history has happened. That is to say, the days when we were helpless to resist slave raiding expeditions launched from Africa. I'll make a few more videos on this neglected subject, I think. In the meantime, as usual, in the description to this video, I give references for those who wish to look into this matter further. At the very least, it's worth bearing all this in mind when we hear black people today moaning about the transatlantic slave trade. At least we have a kind of stake in any discussion on slavery and the slave trade as it touches upon Africa.